They said he was only a stray, but sometimes the loneliest soul in town is the one carrying a story nobody has been willing to hear. Every morning before sunrise, the old railroad station on the edge of Ashwood, Colorado, wakes to the familiar sound of freight trains rolling through the valley and cold mountain winds slipping between weathered wooden buildings that have stood longer than most people can remember. The smell of damp pine, rusted steel, fresh coffee, and melting frost fills the quiet streets as local shop owners unlock their doors and exchange the same conversations they have shared for years. Among those routines, there is one sight nobody questions anymore. A large black and tan German Shepherd appears from behind the abandoned freight warehouse at almost the exact same time every morning. His coat is thick but unkempt, his movements calm and deliberate, his amber eyes quietly observing everything around him without asking anything from anyone. Children whisper as he passes. Tourists take cautious steps away from him. Older residents shake their heads and repeat the same sentence they have spoken for months. Just another stray dog. Nobody knows where he sleeps. Nobody remembers seeing him arrive in town. Yet somehow he always returns to the same streets, following the same route with remarkable patience before disappearing again every evening. Daniel Carter notices something different the very first time he sees the dog. At 34 years old, Daniel has spent most of his life repairing old furniture in the woodworking shop his late father once owned just 2 blocks from the station. His days are predictable, filled with the comforting scent of cedar, walnut, fresh sawdust, and warm varnish. He believes that broken things deserve another chance, whether they are old rocking chairs, forgotten tables, or people carrying invisible burdens. As he unlocks his workshop one cold November morning, he watches the German Shepherd pause beside a weathered bench outside the station. The dog does not search through trash cans. He does not approach anyone for food. He simply stands there, looking toward the empty train platform with quiet focus, as though waiting for someone who never arrives. A passing delivery driver tosses half of a breakfast sandwich onto the sidewalk. The dog slowly turns his head toward the food but never takes a single step closer. Instead, he calmly continues watching the platform before walking away without a sound. Daniel lowers his toolbox onto the wooden porch and quietly follows the dog's movements with growing curiosity. Every instinct tells him that hungry stray dogs rarely ignore an easy meal. This one does. Around noon, Daniel spots him again resting beneath an old maple tree near the courthouse. The German Shepherd remains perfectly still while people hurry past carrying grocery bags and steaming cups of coffee. A little girl smiles and waves from across the street before her mother gently pulls her along without stopping. An elderly man mutters that the town should call animal control. The dog never reacts with fear or anger. He simply watches everyone with calm, patient eyes that seem older than the town itself. Late that afternoon, as golden sunlight stretches across the railroad tracks, Daniel closes his workshop and catches sight of the German Shepherd once more. Without hesitation, the dog begins walking toward a narrow trail disappearing into a grove of towering pine trees beyond the abandoned station. His pace never changes. His ears remain alert. His head stays high with quiet purpose. Daniel takes one careful step after another, leaving the sidewalk behind as the cold mountain air grows still around him. Something deep inside tells him this is not the path of a lost dog wandering without direction. It is the path of someone returning to a place that still matters, even if the rest of the world has already forgotten why. Daniel Carter does not tell anyone that he has decided to follow the German Shepherd again the next evening. Some observations lose their meaning the moment they are shared too early, and something about the quiet animal convinces him that this is one of them. The following afternoon passes slowly inside the woodworking shop as sunlight drifts across unfinished oak tables and the comforting scent of cedar fills the air. Every few minutes Daniel finds himself glancing toward the old railroad station through the front window. Just before 5 o'clock, exactly as the shadows begin stretching across the empty tracks, the familiar figure appears once more. The black and tan German Shepherd emerges from behind the abandoned freight warehouse with the same steady pace, never hurried, never distracted. His ears remain alert, his amber eyes fixed on something only he seems able to see. He does not stop for the people calling out from nearby storefronts. He He ignores the scraps of food left beside a trash can by a well-meaning waitress closing the local diner. Instead, he quietly follows the same cracked sidewalk until he reaches the end of town before turning onto the narrow trail disappearing between tall ponderosa pines. Daniel waits several yards behind, careful not to disturb the silence. The mountain air grows colder beneath the trees, carrying the clean scent of pine needles, damp earth, and melting frost. Fallen leaves soften each step, allowing the only sounds to be distant birds and the gentle whisper of wind moving through evergreen branches. Nearly half a mile into the forest, the German shepherd slows beside a weathered wooden bridge crossing a narrow creek. He pauses there every single time, standing perfectly still while looking downstream for nearly a full minute. Daniel remains hidden behind a large pine trunk, puzzled by the strange ritual. There is nothing unusual beneath the bridge except clear water flowing over smooth stones, yet the dog behaves as though this quiet place deserves respect. Without making a sound, the German shepherd continues onward. A few hundred yards later, he reaches an old stone mile marker leaning beside the forgotten trail. Once again he stops. His nose gently touches the cold surface before he quietly resumes walking. Daniel begins noticing a pattern. None of these pauses are random. Every stop lasts almost exactly the same amount of time. Every movement feels practiced through years of repetition. This is not wandering. It is remembrance. As twilight settles across the forest, the trail finally opens into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. At its center stands an abandoned log cabin whose roof has partially collapsed beneath countless Colorado winters. Wild grass grows between broken porch boards, while faded blue paint still clings to the weathered front door. The German shepherd walks slowly to the edge of the porch but never enters. Instead, he sits facing the cabin with perfect patience, his posture calm and dignified as the final rays of sunlight illuminate his face. Daniel watches from a respectful distance, feeling as though he has stepped into a place where time itself has stopped moving. 10 quiet minutes pass before the dog finally rises. He circles the porch once, lowers his head briefly near the front steps as though greeting someone unseen, then turns back toward town without looking behind him. Daniel waits until the German shepherd disappears among the trees before cautiously approaching the cabin. The silence feels different here, heavier but strangely peaceful. As he reaches the bottom step, something catches the fading light beneath a layer of fallen leaves. It is only the corner of an old leather object barely visible beneath years of dirt. Yet somehow Daniel knows that whatever has been hidden here has been waiting a very long time for someone willing to notice what everyone else had walked past. Daniel kneels beside the worn wooden steps while the last light of day slowly disappears behind the Colorado mountains. The forest grows quieter with every passing minute until only the gentle murmur of the nearby creek and the whisper of pine branches remain. He carefully brushes away layers of damp, leaves covering the old leather object. It is not a wallet as he first imagined. It is a weathered leather collar, cracked by years of snow, rain, and summer heat, but still remarkably intact. A small brass buckle catches the fading light, and beneath it hangs a tarnished identification tag almost completely hidden beneath rust. Daniel gently wipes the surface with the sleeve of his flannel jacket until a single word slowly appears through the years of corrosion. Atlas. He quietly repeats the name to himself, surprised by how naturally it seems to belong to the silent German shepherd. There is no address, no telephone number, only the name and a tiny engraved mountain surrounded by 2 pine trees. Daniel turns the collar over once more before slipping it carefully into the pocket of his jacket. Something tells him the dog never truly lost it. Somehow it simply remained here, waiting beside this forgotten cabin. Before leaving, Daniel studies the weathered building more closely. The porch sags slightly beneath its own age, but nothing else appears damaged by neglect alone. An old rocking chair still faces the valley. Empty flower boxes remain beneath the windows. Even a faded wind chime hangs quietly beneath the porch roof without making a sound. None of it feels abandoned in the ordinary sense. Instead, the entire place feels respectfully untouched, as though time itself has agreed to leave it exactly as someone last remembered it. The following morning, Daniel arrives early at his woodworking shop, but finds it impossible to focus on sanding oak cabinets waiting for delivery. During lunch, he walks across Main Street toward the Ashwood Public Library, a brick building that has watched over the town for nearly a century. Inside, the warm scent of old paper and polished wood replaces the cold mountain air outside. Margaret Ellis, the elderly librarian who has known nearly every family in town for decades, smiles warmly as Daniel approaches the front desk carrying the old collar inside a folded cloth. She adjusts her reading glasses before studying the small brass tag in thoughtful silence. Her gentle smile slowly fades into quiet curiosity. She softly admits that the mountain symbol seems familiar, although she cannot immediately remember why. Together they search through local history books, old property records, and yellowed newspaper archives stacked carefully inside metal cabinets. Hours pass beneath the soft glow of reading lamps while snow begins falling outside the tall library windows. They discover photographs of the abandoned railroad station, articles about the logging industry, and faded maps showing cabins that once belonged to families living deep within the surrounding forest. Yet the mountain emblem refuses to appear anywhere. Just as Daniel prepares to leave, Margaret pauses beside a shelf containing handwritten town history journals donated by longtime residents. She slowly removes one weathered binder covered in faded green cloth and opens it with great care. Tucked between brittle pages rests a photograph no larger than a postcard. It shows a smiling family standing proudly in front of the very same log cabin Daniel visited the previous evening. Beside them sits a young black and tan German shepherd wearing a leather collar that catches the sunlight exactly where the brass buckle reflects in Daniel's pocket. Before he can study the faded faces more closely, Margaret quietly whispers that she remembers hearing this family's name many years ago, although nobody has spoken about them in a very long time. Margaret carefully places the faded photograph beneath the warm pool of light cast by the reading lamp, her fingers lingering on its worn edges as though afraid that even the gentlest touch might disturb the memories resting inside it. Daniel leans closer, studying every detail that decades had almost erased. The family appears happy, standing shoulder to shoulder on the front porch of the log cabin beneath a bright Colorado sky. A man in a denim jacket smiles proudly beside a woman whose hand rests gently on the shoulder of a young boy no older than 8. Sitting faithfully at their feet is the same black and tan German shepherd, his ears standing tall, his posture calm, and around his neck hangs the unmistakable leather collar now resting inside Daniel's jacket pocket. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink that has nearly disappeared with time, are only a few simple words. Autumn, 1998. Carter Ridge Cabin. Together, always. Daniel quietly repeats the location to himself. Carter Ridge. The name sounds strangely familiar, although he cannot remember why. Margaret slowly closes her eyes for a brief moment before a memory finally returns. She explains that when she first moved to Ashwood nearly 30 years earlier, older residents often spoke about a family who lived beyond the old logging trails. They were known for their kindness, welcoming stranded hikers, sharing vegetables from their garden, and offering warm meals to anyone who reached their cabin before a snowstorm. Then, one year, the family simply disappeared from everyday conversation. Nobody ever claimed they had moved away. Nobody ever spoke of tragedy. It was as if the entire town had quietly agreed to let the story fade into silence. Daniel asks why. Margaret can only shake her head. She remembers hearing adults lower their voices whenever the family was mentioned, but as a newcomer, she never felt comfortable asking questions. Outside the library windows, snowflakes drift lazily through the evening air, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and the old railroad tracks in a fresh blanket of white. Daniel slips the photograph back onto the table while his thoughts return to the German shepherd sitting patiently before the abandoned cabin every single evening. If the dog truly belongs to the family in the picture, the numbers no longer make sense. Nearly 3 decades have passed since that photograph was taken. No ordinary dog could have remained there all those years. The realization settles quietly in his mind. Perhaps the German shepherd is not the same dog after all. Perhaps he is connected to the family in another way that nobody has yet understood. The following afternoon, Daniel returns to the station earlier than usual, determined to observe the dog before following him again. Atlas appears exactly on schedule, emerging from behind the freight warehouse with the same calm confidence that has become part of the town's unnoticed rhythm. Several people glance toward him before continuing their conversations without concern. One impatient shop owner steps outside holding a broom and waves it through the air, urging the dog to leave the sidewalk. Atlas simply changes direction without showing fear, resentment, or confusion. He never growls. He never barks. He walks away with quiet dignity, as though he has long accepted that misunderstanding can become a daily companion. Daniel watches the moment with a heaviness he cannot explain. Most people see an unwanted stray. He is beginning to see something entirely different. As Atlas reaches the edge of town, he pauses for only a second and slowly turns his head toward Daniel. Their eyes meet across the empty street. There is no hesitation, no surprise, only a calm expression that feels almost like recognition before the German shepherd continues toward the pine trail once again, inviting Daniel to follow a path that is revealing far more than either of them expected. Daniel follows several minutes behind Atlas, careful to leave only faint footprints in the thin layer of fresh snow that now blankets the forest trail. The late afternoon sky glows with soft shades of amber and pale blue as sunlight filters through towering ponderosa pines, painting long shadows across the quiet ground. Everything around them seems to breathe more slowly here. The scent of evergreen needles mixes with damp earth and cold mountain air, while the distant creek continues its endless conversation with the smooth stones beneath its clear water. Atlas never looks hurried. Every step is measured, familiar, almost ceremonial. He pauses once again at the old wooden bridge, lowering his head toward the flowing stream before continuing toward the abandoned cabin. This time Daniel notices something he had missed before. Along the edge of the trail, almost hidden beneath winter grass, stand several weathered wooden posts. Most have fallen sideways with age, but one still remains upright. Its faded lettering can barely be read beneath patches of moss. Carter Ridge Trail. The words send a quiet chill through Daniel that has nothing to do with the cold. The name matches the faded note written behind the family photograph. When Atlas reaches the clearing, he repeats the same peaceful routine. He circles the porch once before sitting in complete silence, facing the weathered front door. Daniel chooses not to disturb him. Instead, he slowly walks around the outside of the cabin, studying details that now seem impossible to ignore. A rusted watering can rests beside an overgrown flower bed where dried lavender stalks still stand against the snow. Wind chimes carved from polished cedar hang beneath the porch roof, untouched by even the gentlest breeze. Beneath one window sits a cracked wooden crate filled with smooth river stones, each carefully arranged by hand many years ago. Nothing here feels abandoned by neglect. Everything feels preserved by love. As Daniel reaches the back of the cabin, he notices a narrow path leading toward a small wooden shed leaning slightly beneath the weight of countless winters. Its door hangs partly open. Inside, shelves remain lined with neatly stacked glass jars, empty baskets, old gardening tools, and a thick layer of dust that sparkles in the fading light. On a workbench rests a small metal box covered by a folded canvas cloth. Daniel hesitates before lifting the lid. Inside, he finds several carefully protected belongings wrapped in oil paper. There is a pocket watch whose hands stopped long ago, a bundle of handwritten letters tied together with blue ribbon, and a simple leather notebook worn smooth by years of careful use. Before opening it, Daniel hears soft footsteps outside. Atlas stands quietly in the doorway of the shed, watching him with calm amber eyes. There is no fear in the dog's expression, no sign that he wants Daniel to leave. Instead, he slowly walks toward the workbench and gently places one paw beside the old notebook before looking back at Daniel again. The silent gesture feels unmistakable. Daniel carefully unties the ribbon around the notebook and opens the first page. The paper has yellowed with age, but the handwriting remains remarkably clear. Across the top, written in careful blue ink, are 8 simple words that seem to stop time itself. If you are reading this, thank you for finding him. Daniel slowly raises his eyes toward Atlas, whose steady gaze never leaves his face. And for the first time, he realizes that the faithful journey repeated every single day has never been about waiting for someone to return. It has always been about waiting for someone willing to understand. Daniel lowers himself onto the old wooden stool inside the shed, while the last light of evening slips quietly through the dusty window. Atlas remains just outside the doorway, resting peacefully on the weathered porch as though he has completed the most important part of his journey simply by bringing someone here. The notebook feels surprisingly warm in Daniel's hands despite the cold mountain air surrounding the cabin. He carefully turns the first page, revealing handwriting so steady and thoughtful that it almost sounds like a voice carried across the years. The entry begins with a simple introduction. My name is Thomas Bennett. If these pages have found you, then my family is no longer here to tell this story themselves. Daniel continues reading in complete silence. Thomas writes about the cabin, the long winters, the garden that flourished every spring, and the joy of raising his young son among endless forests where every sunrise felt like a promise. He describes the faithful German shepherd who became part of their family long before the boy could even ride a bicycle. The dog's name was Atlas. He was never treated as a pet. He was a companion, a guardian, and often the first to notice when someone needed comfort before they spoke a single word. Daniel pauses and slowly looks toward the doorway where the present-day Atlas quietly watches the fading sky. The resemblance is remarkable, yet impossible to explain. He returns to the notebook. Several pages later, Thomas explains that Atlas became the father of a litter of puppies born during an unusually gentle spring. One male puppy looked almost identical to him, right down to the small patch of lighter fur beneath his chin. The family decided that each firstborn guardian would inherit the same name. Atlas was never meant to belong to one dog alone. It was a promise passed from one faithful generation to the next. Daniel feels a quiet shiver as the mystery slowly begins arranging itself into something both ordinary and extraordinary. The German shepherd outside is not the same dog from the faded photograph. He is the latest guardian carrying the same name, the same path, and perhaps the same silent purpose entrusted through generations. The notebook continues with careful instructions. Every evening, Atlas walks the trail so the cabin will never truly be forgotten. Every season, someone should remember that love is measured not only by the years people stay together, but by the promises they continue to keep after life changes everything. Thomas writes that memories disappear only when nobody chooses to carry them forward. Daniel closes the notebook for a long moment, listening to the wind moving softly through the towering pines surrounding the clearing. Suddenly, the lonely rituals he has witnessed no longer seem strange. The pauses at the bridge, the stone marker, the porch, and the silent wait before the front door all belong to a tradition that has quietly survived while the town forgot the family who created it. As darkness settles across Carter Ridge, Atlas slowly rises and walks toward Daniel without hesitation. He gently rests his head against Daniel's hand for the first time. No fear remains between them, no distance, only quiet trust shared beneath a sky filled with the first stars of the evening. Daniel softly scratches behind the dog's ears and whispers the only words that feel worthy of the moment. I understand now. Atlas closes his eyes for a brief second before turning toward the cabin once more. In that peaceful silence, Daniel realizes that understanding the story is only the beginning. The greater responsibility will be deciding whether he is willing to become the next person entrusted to keep it alive. The next morning arrives beneath a sky the color of brushed silver, and Ashwood slowly awakens beneath a fresh blanket of snow that softens every rooftop, fence, and winding street. Daniel carries the leather notebook carefully inside his canvas satchel, as though it contains something far more fragile than paper. In many ways it does. It carries the quiet heartbeat of a family that the town has almost forgotten. Before opening his woodworking shop, he walks across Main Street toward the library once again. Margaret is already arranging returned books when she notices the thoughtful expression on his face. Without speaking, Daniel places the notebook gently onto the reading table. Margaret opens it with careful hands, reading only the first several pages before her eyes begin to glisten. She removes her glasses and sits silently for several moments, allowing the words to settle into memories that have waited many years to be understood. She softly explains that Thomas Bennett had once volunteered at nearly every community gathering, repairing fences for elderly neighbors and helping maintain the old church whenever winter storms caused damage. His wife, Eleanor, organized summer reading afternoons for children beneath the large maple tree beside the library. Their son, Samuel, had become known for leaving handmade bird feeders throughout the forests surrounding Carter Ridge. They were ordinary people who quietly filled empty spaces with kindness until one difficult winter forced them to relocate closer to specialized medical care for Eleanor's aging father in another state. They had planned to return within a year. Life simply carried them farther away than they ever imagined. Daniel listens carefully as the missing pieces begin fitting together. There had never been a tragedy hidden inside whispers. There had only been distance, changing seasons, and time moving faster than promises could keep pace. The cabin remained because selling it never felt right. The notebook remained because Thomas believed someone would eventually understand why Atlas continued returning. Margaret smiles gently and points toward one final page tucked near the back. Folded inside rests an unopened envelope with Daniel's name written nowhere upon it. Only a simple message addressed to whoever finds this place with a kind heart. Daniel carefully opens the envelope. Inside rests a single handwritten letter. Thomas writes that every generation leaves behind something that cannot be measured in money or property. Some leave wisdom. Some leave forgiveness. His family hoped to leave proof that loyalty can outlive absence if someone is willing to remember. He explains that each generation of Atlas had been raised to follow the same trail, not because the cabin needed guarding, but because memories deserve witnesses. Daniel quietly folds the letter and looks through the library window toward the snow-covered mountains rising beyond town. Suddenly he understands why Atlas never begged for food or searched for a new home. The dog had never been searching for someone to rescue him. He had been patiently searching for someone worthy of receiving a promise that had traveled across generations. That evening, Daniel walks to the railroad station before sunset, carrying a small thermos of warm water and a thick wool blanket folded beneath his arm. Atlas appears from behind the old freight warehouse exactly as always. This time, Daniel does not follow from a distance. He simply falls into step beside him. Neither one hurries. Neither one needs words. Their footsteps move together across the familiar trail while snowflakes drift gently through the pine branches above them. At the old wooden bridge, Atlas pauses as he always has. But instead of standing alone, Daniel quietly stops beside him and gazes down at the clear water flowing endlessly beneath the weathered boards. For the first time in many years, the silent tradition is no longer carried by only one faithful soul. Winter settles gently over Ashwood during the following weeks, and without anyone noticing, a quiet routine begins reshaping two lives at the same time. Every evening just before sunset, Daniel closes his woodworking shop, brushes the fine cedar dust from his jacket, fills a small canvas bag with fresh water and a simple meal, and walks toward the old railroad station. Atlas is always there, emerging from the shadows of the abandoned freight warehouse with the same calm dignity that first captured Daniel's attention. They no longer travel as a man following a mystery. They walk together like old friends, honoring a promise that neither of them fully owns. Along the familiar trail, Daniel begins seeing details that had escaped him before. The wooden bridge is not simply a place where Atlas pauses. Small initials have been carved into one of its weathered railings, softened by decades of rain and snow. The old stone mile marker still bears faint traces of blue paint that once guided hikers toward Carter Ridge. Even the towering pine beside the creek carries an old metal hook where a lantern must have hung long ago, gently lighting the path for travelers returning home after sunset. Every stop along the trail tells a story once someone chooses to look closely enough. At the cabin, Daniel carefully cleans fallen branches from the porch without disturbing its quiet character. He repairs a loose step using reclaimed wood from his own workshop, matching every cut so perfectly that the repair seems to disappear into the original craftsmanship. He oils the rusted hinges of the front door, straightens the old rocking chair, and gently untangles the cedar wind chimes until they finally sing again whenever the mountain breeze passes through the clearing. Atlas watches each small act without excitement or surprise, almost as though he had always known someone would eventually arrive to continue what others had begun. One snowy afternoon, Daniel opens the remaining bundle of letters stored inside the metal box. Most describe ordinary moments that somehow feel extraordinary now. Thomas writes about teaching Samuel to skip stones across the creek. Eleanor describes baking fresh apple pie, while Atlas waited patiently beneath the kitchen window for the first warm crust to cool. Another letter tells of neighbors gathering every autumn to harvest pumpkins before sharing soup around a fire beneath the stars. None of the pages speak about grand achievements. They celebrate ordinary days lived with extraordinary gratitude. Daniel begins understanding why Atlas never abandoned this place. He was not protecting a building. He was protecting the memory of a life built upon kindness so quiet that history almost failed to record it. One Saturday morning, Daniel asks Margaret whether anyone in town might still remember the Bennett family personally. She thinks for a long moment before mentioning Harold Whittaker, a retired mail carrier now in his late 80s who still lives on the western edge of Ashwood. Harold delivered letters to Carter Ridge for nearly 20 years before retiring. That afternoon, Daniel drives through gently falling snow to Harold's small white farmhouse. The elderly man welcomes him inside with warm coffee and homemade oatmeal cookies. When Daniel places the faded photograph onto the kitchen table, Harold studies it for only a heartbeat before smiling with unmistakable recognition. His weathered face softens as though an old friend has quietly stepped back into the room. He points toward the German shepherd in the picture and softly says that every atlas knew the trail better than any map ever printed, because each one had been taught by the generation before. Then Harold looks directly at Daniel and adds one sentence that makes the room fall completely silent. The family never expected the dogs to guard the cabin forever. They prayed that one day the dogs would finally find someone kind enough to carry the memory instead. Daniel leaves Harold Whittaker's farmhouse just as the last light of day settles across the snow-covered valley, carrying the old man's words with him like another page added to the notebook. The road back to Ashwood feels quieter than usual. Every fence buried beneath fresh snow, every weathered barn, every line of cottonwood trees standing against the pale winter sky seems connected by invisible threads of memory that had always existed but had gone unnoticed. When he reaches the railroad station, Atlas is already waiting beside the familiar wooden bench, sitting with perfect patience as though he somehow knows another piece of the story has finally found its rightful place. Daniel smiles softly and kneels beside him, gently fastening the restored leather collar around the German shepherd's neck. The worn brass buckle catches the fading sunlight for only a moment before disappearing beneath the thick black and tan fur. Atlas does not resist. He simply lowers his head for a brief second, then looks toward the pine trail with calm acceptance. Together they begin the familiar walk once again. The evening air carries the clean scent of snow and evergreen while distant train whistles echo across the valley, blending with the quiet rhythm of their footsteps. As they pass the old bridge, Daniel notices something unexpected. Atlas does not stop where he always has. Instead, he continues farther along the trail, leaving the familiar route for the first time since Daniel met him. Curious but trusting, Daniel follows without hesitation. The narrow path winds deeper into the forest where taller pines block much of the fading light. The silence grows richer rather than lonely, filled with the gentle sound of snow slipping from heavy branches and the distant call of a raven somewhere beyond the ridge. After nearly a quarter mile, Atlas slows before a large granite outcrop rising from the hillside. Hidden beneath low cedar branches stands a small wooden marker almost completely covered by moss and drifting snow. Daniel carefully brushes away the frost with his gloved hand. Simple carved letters slowly emerge beneath the ice. Bennett family overlook. No dates. No grand inscription. Only a quiet name resting peacefully above the valley they once called home. Atlas walks forward and lies down beside the marker with quiet reverence. Daniel stands silently beside him, looking out across the landscape below. From this height, he can see the old railroad station, the church steeple, the library roof, and the winding streets of Ashwood glowing beneath the first lights of evening. Suddenly he understands why the cabin had been built where it was. The family had chosen a place where they could watch over the town they loved without needing to stand at its center. As Daniel quietly reflects, a small metal object partly buried beneath the snow catches his attention near the base of the marker. He gently lifts it free. It is an old compass enclosed in polished brass, its glass still remarkably clear despite the passing years. Folded beneath it rests a waterproof envelope carefully protected inside waxed canvas. Daniel opens it with slow, careful hands. Inside is a single photograph taken many years after the first one he had discovered. Samuel is now a young man standing beside an older atlas beneath the same overlook. Written across the bottom in neat handwriting are only a few words. Home is never the place you leave. Home is the promise you return to. Daniel feels his eyes linger on the valley below before turning toward Atlas, who quietly watches the town from the same peaceful overlook his family had chosen generations before. In that silent moment, Daniel realizes the final truth has never been hidden inside the cabin, the notebook, or the letters. It has always been waiting here, where loyalty quietly becomes legacy and where every faithful journey finds its way home. The days that follow carry an unexpected sense of peace through Ashwood, although very few people understand why Daniel Carter seems lighter each morning. He continues opening his woodworking shop before sunrise, filling the rooms with the familiar scent of fresh cedar and polished walnut, but every evening belongs to a different purpose now. Atlas waits faithfully near the old railroad station, and together they walk the winding trail toward Carter Ridge as though the mountains themselves have accepted Daniel into a tradition that began long before he was born. Winter gradually softens its grip, and beneath the melting snow tiny patches of green begin appearing along the forest floor. The cedar wind chimes outside the cabin sing more often as warmer breezes return, carrying gentle notes through the clearing where silence once stood alone. Daniel carefully restores small pieces of the property without changing its spirit. He repairs loose fence rails using reclaimed timber, clears fallen branches from the garden path, and places the old rocking chair back where Thomas Bennett had once watched sunsets beside his family. Atlas quietly follows every movement, sometimes resting beneath the porch, sometimes sitting near the overlook, always calm, always watchful. One Saturday morning, Daniel invites Margaret and Harold to visit Carter Ridge together. Neither has stood on the property in decades. The climb is slower now for both of them, yet neither complains. When they reach the cabin, Margaret pauses beneath the porch and gently touches the faded blue paint with trembling fingertips. Harold removes his hat without speaking. For several long moments, the only sound comes from the wind moving through towering pines above them. Margaret quietly recognizes the flower beds Eleanor had planted every spring. Harold smiles as he notices the restored bridge railing and the lantern hook beside the trail. Memories that had once belonged to only 3 aging hearts now seem to settle naturally into the place where they were first created. Daniel brings the notebook onto the porch and carefully reads several passages aloud while Atlas lies peacefully at their feet. Thomas's words sound almost alive among the trees. He writes that kindness never disappears when it is shared. It simply waits for another pair of hands willing to continue it. When Daniel finishes reading, none of them speak immediately. Some truths become stronger inside silence than conversation. Before leaving, Harold reaches into his coat pocket and removes a small brass key that has traveled with him for many years. He explains that Thomas had once asked him to keep it safe if the family ever remained away longer than expected. Harold had almost forgotten it himself until seeing the notebook again. The old key fits perfectly into the small cabinet built beside the stone fireplace inside the cabin. Daniel slowly opens its weathered wooden door. Resting neatly upon a folded quilt is a simple wooden box carved by hand. Inside lies the original deed to the cabin, several family photographs never placed in albums, and one final handwritten letter dated only a few months before the Bennetts left Colorado. Thomas writes that if the cabin is ever opened again by someone with compassion rather than curiosity, he hopes that person will never think of the place as abandoned. A home only becomes empty when nobody chooses to fill it with kindness. Daniel gently closes the box and looks toward Atlas, whose amber eyes reflect the warm afternoon sunlight spilling through the cabin window. In that quiet moment, every question that had first drawn Daniel into the forest finds its answer. The faithful German shepherd had never spent years searching for his family. He had spent them patiently leading another good heart to the place where their kindness could begin again, ensuring that love passed forward instead of quietly fading away with time. News travels through a small town the way spring sunlight moves across a mountain valley, quietly at first and then all at once. Within a few weeks, people begin noticing that the old German Shepherd is no longer wandering the streets alone. Every evening, just before the church bell marks 6 o'clock, Daniel closes his woodworking shop, locks the front door, and walks beside Atlas toward the old railroad station before disappearing together into the pine-covered hills. Curiosity slowly replaces old assumptions. The waitress who once left scraps beside the trash can now carries a clean bowl of fresh water to the station each afternoon. The delivery driver who had tossed half a breakfast sandwich onto the sidewalk one cold morning now kneels to gently scratch behind Atlas's ears before beginning his route. Even the impatient shop owner who had once waved a broom to chase the dog away quietly removes an old sign leaning against his storefront and replaces it with a wooden planter filled with bright yellow daisies. Nobody speaks openly about regret, yet it quietly appears in small acts of kindness that require no explanation. Daniel never tells the entire story all at once. Instead, he shares it one memory at a time. He invites Margaret to display copies of the Bennett family photographs inside the library beside a small handwritten history describing Carter Ridge and the generations of faithful German shepherds named Atlas. Harold contributes several faded postcards that Thomas Bennett once mailed from nearby logging camps during long work seasons. Children visiting the library stop to study the photographs, smiling as they compare the young Atlas in the old pictures to the gentle dog now sleeping peacefully beneath Daniel's workbench every morning. One Saturday, the town council gathers for its monthly meeting inside the old community hall. Among discussions about road repairs and summer festivals, Daniel quietly asks for permission to restore the neglected Carter Ridge Trail using volunteer labor from the community. The request surprises everyone. For years, the forgotten path had existed only on outdated maps, its history fading beneath weeds and fallen branches. After a long silence, hands begin rising one after another. Carpenters offer lumber. Gardeners volunteer native wildflowers. High school students promise to clear brush after classes. Nobody votes against the idea. On the first warm weekend of April, nearly 30 residents gather at the trailhead carrying rakes, shovels, paintbrushes, and work gloves. Laughter drifts through the forest as families trim overgrown branches, repair weathered signs, and rebuild sections of the old wooden bridge. Atlas walks calmly among them, accepting gentle pats from children and grateful smiles from adults who once hurried past him without a second glance. The dog never behaves as though he has earned their admiration. He simply continues leading people along the familiar path with the same quiet dignity he carried when nobody knew his story. By late afternoon, the cabin porch is filled with neighbors sharing homemade pies, fresh bread, and steaming cups of coffee while the restored cedar wind chimes sing softly above them. Daniel looks around the gathering and realizes that Carter Ridge no longer belongs only to the Bennett family. Their kindness has quietly taken root again in the hearts of people they never expected to meet. As the golden light of sunset settles across the valley below, Atlas walks to the edge of the overlook and sits facing the town in peaceful silence. One by one, conversations fade until everyone is simply watching the same beautiful view together. No speeches are given. No grand ceremony is needed. Sometimes healing begins the moment people choose to see with their hearts what their eyes had overlooked for far too long. Spring settles gently over Ashwood as though the mountains themselves have decided to breathe a little more slowly. Wildflowers begin returning to the edges of Carter Ridge Trail, painting the forest with soft shades of blue, yellow, and white. The creek beside the old wooden bridge runs fuller now, carrying clear mountain water that sparkles beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Every evening, Daniel and Atlas continue their familiar walk, but the journey no longer feels like a search. It feels like gratitude expressed one quiet step at a time. The cabin slowly becomes part of the town once again, without ever losing the peaceful solitude that had protected its memories for so many years. Daniel carefully restores only what time had damaged. He leaves every carved initial, every weathered floorboard, and every faded mark exactly where history placed them. Margaret organizes a small shelf inside the library dedicated to the Bennett family journals, preserving copies so future generations can discover them without disturbing the originals resting safely inside the cabin. Harold visits whenever the weather allows, sitting for hours in the old rocking chair while sharing forgotten stories that make everyone laugh. He remembers Samuel trying to teach Atlas to catch snowflakes without success, Eleanor filling the porch with the scent of cinnamon bread every Sunday morning, and Thomas insisting that every stranger deserved to leave the cabin feeling more welcome than when they arrived. Children from the elementary school begin taking guided nature walks along Carter Ridge each month. Daniel teaches them how to recognize pine, cedar, and aspen by their bark and leaves. Margaret reads passages from Thomas's notebook beneath the tall trees, while Atlas lies peacefully beside the group, surrounded by curious little hands eager to stroke his thick fur. The children no longer ask why the German Shepherd always walks the same trail. They simply smile and follow him, accepting that some traditions become beautiful precisely because they continue without needing to be explained. One afternoon, a family traveling across Colorado stops at the library after seeing a small sign pointing toward Carter Ridge Historic Trail. They spend the day exploring the restored path before leaving a handwritten note inside the guest journal Daniel has quietly placed on the cabin table. Thank you for reminding us that kindness can wait patiently for someone to discover it. Soon another family leaves a similar message. Then another. None of them know the Bennetts personally, yet every visitor seems to leave carrying a little of their spirit back into the wider world. Daniel often stands alone on the overlook just before sunset, watching golden light spread across Ashwood below. Atlas always sits beside him without needing a command, the restored leather collar resting comfortably around his neck as the evening breeze gently stirs the cedar wind chimes behind them. Daniel realizes that the promise Thomas Bennett once wrote about has already moved beyond one family, one cabin, or even one faithful dog. It has become part of the town itself. People wave more often. Neighbors linger a little longer in conversation. The old railroad station, once ignored except by passing trains, now holds a simple wooden bench with a brass plaque installed by anonymous hands. It bears only one sentence: "Every soul deserves to be truly seen." As twilight settles across the valley, Atlas quietly rises and begins walking back toward town with Daniel beside him. Their shadows stretch across the familiar trail, blending together beneath the towering pines until it becomes impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins, as though friendship itself has become another enduring path through the forest, waiting patiently for those willing to follow it. Autumn returns to Ashwood exactly 1 year after Daniel Carter first noticed the quiet German Shepherd standing alone beside the old railroad station. The cottonwood leaves glow with shades of gold, crimson, and amber, while crisp mountain air carries the familiar scent of cedar, pine, and distant wood smoke drifting from chimneys throughout the valley. Some seasons change the landscape. Others quietly change the people living within it. On a calm October afternoon, Daniel closes his woodworking shop a little earlier than usual. Atlas is already waiting outside, his amber eyes bright beneath the gentle afternoon sun, the restored leather collar resting comfortably around his neck like a promise finally fulfilled. Together, they begin the familiar walk toward Carter Ridge, following the trail that no longer feels forgotten. Families pass them with warm smiles. Children wave excitedly before racing ahead to count colorful leaves scattered across the path. Hikers pause beside the restored bridge to admire the clear mountain creek flowing beneath weathered wooden planks that now stand strong once again. Nobody calls Atlas a stray anymore. They greet him by name, often thanking him without fully realizing why the words feel so important. When Daniel and Atlas reach the cabin, they find fresh wildflowers resting inside a small mason jar on the porch. No note accompanies them. None is needed. Someone has quietly continued the tradition of kindness without expecting recognition. Daniel smiles as he replaces the water inside the vase before carrying the flowers into the cabin, where afternoon sunlight pours gently through the old windows, filling every room with warm golden light. The cedar wind chimes softly welcome the mountain breeze, sounding almost exactly as they must have years before when Thomas, Eleanor, Samuel, and the first Atlas called this place home. As evening approaches, Daniel and Atlas climb together to the Bennett family overlook. The valley below glows beneath countless porch lights as Ashwood prepares for another peaceful night. The library windows shine warmly. The church bell rings across the hills. A freight train rolls quietly through the station before disappearing beyond the western ridge, its whistle echoing gently across the mountains. Daniel unfolds the old photograph one last time, studying the smiling family standing beside the German shepherd who first carried the name Atlas. He places the photograph back inside its protective envelope before looking toward the faithful companion sitting beside him. Atlas quietly rests his head against Daniel's shoulder without asking for anything in return. They remain there until the first stars begin appearing above the mountains. Silence fills the overlook, but it no longer feels empty. It feels complete. Before leaving, Daniel opens the guest journal he keeps inside his satchel and writes a single sentence beneath hundreds of messages left by visitors from across the country. "We came looking for an old story and found a better way to live." He closes the journal, returns it to the cabin, and gently locks the little wooden cabinet before stepping outside once more. The evening breeze carries the scent of fallen leaves through the towering pines as Atlas begins walking toward home. Daniel follows beside him, not because the dog needs company anymore, but because some paths become part of the heart once they have been walked with love often enough. Behind them, the cabin stands peacefully beneath the fading sky, no longer waiting to be remembered because remembrance has become part of everyday life. Ahead of them, the lights of Ashwood grow brighter with every step. The journey that began with misunderstanding has quietly become a legacy of compassion carried from one generation to the next. And somewhere beyond words, beyond photographs, beyond seasons, the smallest acts of kindness continue doing what they have always done, leading one faithful soul to another until nobody has to walk alone again.